Eastern Germany, early April 1945. The air vibrated with the distant thunder of Soviet guns. A column of 150 emaciated Allied prisoners stumbled westward on a forced march, herded by a handful of elderly Volkssturm guards who threatened to shoot any man who fell behind. It was a scene of despair and imminent slaughter. Then, from within the ranks, a figure stepped forward. He wore a tattered Allied tunic, but over it, he had donned a salvaged German field cap and a Wehrmacht greatcoat, pieces hoarded for this moment. In flawless, commanding German, he barked at the lead guard, Leutnant Müller, Feldgendarmerie. I am taking command of this work detail. Your orders have been countermanded. The old guard, bewildered by the collapse around him and faced with an apparent officer, hesitated, then saluted. The transfer of authority was complete in a sentence. This was not a solo dash for freedom. It was a mass jailbreak performed in broad daylight. For the next 150 miles, this POW would lead his fellow prisoners not into hiding, but straight down the crumbling Reich's main roads, using the enemy's own disintegrating chain of command as their passport. He would bluff through checkpoints, requisition food, and march 150 men directly toward the sound of American guns. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. The ultimate act of liberation was an act of perfect imitation. He didn't escape the system. He hijacked it. But how did one man pull off the ultimate bluff in history's most chaotic moment? And what does his story reveal about the power of audacity when empires fall? To understand the sheer scale of this deception, German guard protocols and POW camp evacuation orders show we must first descend into the hellish final act of the Nazi prison system. The spring of 1945 saw the Nazi prison state unravel in a frenzy of panicked brutality. Fearing the Soviet advance, the German High Command ordered the forced evacuation of POW camps in the east. The result was the death marches. Thousands of Allied prisoners were driven westward on foot in winter conditions with minimal rations, shelter, or medical care, guarded by men who were often as desperate as they were. This was not a system of tight control, but one of catastrophic, murderous improvisation. Its administrative backbone had shattered. Communications between commands were sporadic or non-existent. Guard units were hastily assembled from the dregs of German manpower. Volkssturm conscripts, either teenagers or elderly men, often poorly armed, untrained in prisoner handling, and terrified of the front rapidly overtaking them. Regular army officers were scarce, many having fled to avoid Soviet capture. In this vortex of fear and confusion, authority became a fluid concept. A guard's primary motivations were personal survival and a vague directive to keep moving west. They were psychologically primed to defer to anyone who appeared to have a clear plan and the bearing of command. The broader landscape was one of apocalyptic chaos, roads choked with refugees, deserters, and shattered military units. One more column of weary men was a barely noticed element in the collapse. This environment of extreme violence and extreme fragility created a paradoxical opportunity. Within the brutal shell of the marching column, the traditional hierarchy of captor and captive had become dangerously ambiguous. In the freezing columns of prisoners, one man saw not just suffering, but a fleeting chance. His own background, as revealed in repatriation interviews, made him the perfect candidate to seize it. The prisoners were caught in a fatal trap. The forced march was a death sentence carried out in slow motion. Men died from exposure in freezing rain, collapsed from starvation, or were executed by nervous guards for falling a few paces behind. The German countryside offered no sanctuary. For a lone escapee in a stolen uniform or ragged battle dress, the risk of betrayal by a civilian for a food ration was high. Organizing a mass breakout against armed guards, however desperate those guards were, would trigger a certain massacre. The prisoners faced a collective action dilemma of the most brutal kind. How could 150 starving, exhausted men simultaneously escape the very mechanism that was killing them? The radical insight was to see the march not as a chain, but as a vehicle. The column itself, the source of their misery, was the only thing moving with any authority through the collapsing Reich. If they could seize control of its direction and purpose, they could transform it from a death sentence into a Trojan horse. The stakes of such an attempt were apocalyptic. Failure meant the ringleader would be shot on the spot, likely followed by reprisal killings. Success, however, offered the only plausible path to salvation for the entire group. To march not into a German-held zone or the cauldron of the Eastern Front, but directly toward the advancing American lines. The leader's plan, as recounted later to intelligence officers, was not born of complex tools, was born of psychology. He wouldn't need a wire cutter or a map. He would need a jacket, a hat, and a tone of voice that brooked no argument. The strategy was a masterclass in psychological subterfuge, built on meticulous preparation. The uniform was a patchwork masterpiece of clandestine acquisition. A Feldblues tunic bartered from a corrupt guard or lifted from a laundry line. Officers' Litzen collar tabs painstakingly crafted from tin cans. A weathered Shermit's visor cap that became the crown of his authority. An empty holster on a belt completed the silhouette of command. He practiced wearing it in secret, adapting his posture to the stolen cloth. More crucial than the cloth was the performance. The leader was almost certainly a fluent German speaker, likely with a convincing regional accent honed in pre-war life or through intense study in the camp. He absorbed officer mannerisms, the clipped, impatient tone, the expected bureaucratic jargon of a Marschbell march order, the palpable contempt for lower ranks and re-echelon chaos. He crafted a plausible legend, Lieutenant Muller, a wounded veteran from the Eastern Front, reassigned to the grim but critical duty of prisoner logistics. The innovation lay in timing and target selection. He bided his time, waiting for the moment of maximum German vulnerability. During a confusing merger of refugee streams, a blizzard that reduced visibility to meters or the precise moment when exhausted, regular guards were relieved by terrified Volkssturm. He aimed his performance not at their diligence, but at their fear and their desperate desire for someone, anyone, to give them clear orders. The final vital component was the buy-in from the 149 other POWs. This was a collective conspiracy of silence and performance. They had to perfect their own roles, eyes downcast, shoulders slumped, responding with sullen sluggishness to the officer's barked commands, becoming the perfect backdrop of broken prisoners against which his authority seemed unquestionable.
The moment arrived.
As the column straggled into a hamlet for a wretched night's rest in a barn, the leader changed in the darkness. At dawn, he emerged. Contemporary German police reports from the region, once classified, later noted the baffling passage of a prisoner column under the command of an unfamiliar, severe young officer. The moment of truth was a collision of wills in the muddy dawn. The leader, now Lieutenant Muller, strode directly to the senior guard, a Jeffreiter in his 50s. He didn't request. He commanded. Asterisk Jeffreiter. Lieutenant Muller. Feldersatzbataillon 112. I have orders from the Ortskommandantur to take charge of this detail for fortification work at Grid 48 Talfa. Asterisk his voice was a lash of impatience. Might flash a grimy typewritten sheet. Pure nonsense. But covered in official-looking stamps. He berated the guard for the prisoner's wretched state, turning the man's failure into the pretext for his own takeover. The silent negotiation played out on the guard's face. Confusion, fear of a junior officer's wrath, and ultimately, a palpable relief. The burden of command for these starving men, in this collapsing world, was lifted from his shoulders. With a muttered Jawohl, Herr Lieutenant, Zubefell, he snapped a salute and ordered his bewildered comrades to fall in behind the new officer. The column reformed. As it moved out, the subtle shift began. The compass bearing imperceptibly turning from a northwesterly route deeper into Germany to a southwesterly heading toward the rolling thunder of the American advance. The first test came immediately, passing a squad of weary Wehrmacht infantry trudging the other way. The leader offered a curt, authoritative nod. The infantry sergeant, seeing the officer's cap and the column of prisoners, automatically saluted. The bluff held. Each return salute was a brick laid in the road to freedom, each one reinforcing the fiction for the real guards now following at the rear. With command secured, the long march began. But as the column moved deeper into the disintegrating Reich, the leader's debrief reveals every hour brought a new, potentially fatal test of his performance. The climax came at a bridge outside Leipzig. It's controlled by a mixed detail of army engineers and a Feldgendarmerie, Unteroffizier, who still cared about procedure. As the column approached, the NCO stepped forward, his hand raised. Halt. Papier. Marschbell. The leader presented his forged movement order. The Unteroffizier studied it, his brow furrowed. This is from Feldersatzbataillon 112 *. That unit was dissolved last month. What is your current camp front assignment? The air froze. The leader didn't flinch. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, then rising to a public rebuke. You question my orders? While the front collapses? Look at these men. He gestured contemptuously at the ragged prisoners. They are the only labor left to dig the anti-tank ditches your comrades need. Now, do you wish to sign for their delay and explain it to the Standartenfer at headquarters, or will you do your duty and let us pass? He invoked the terrifying specter of the SS Standartenfer to crush army bureaucracy. The NCO's eyes flickered from the dubious paper to the officer's furious face, to the pitiful column, and finally to the eastern horizon where the war's thunder rolled. His desire to follow the rules warred with his terror of making a catastrophic mistake. In the end, bureaucratic cowardice won. The safer path was to let this angry officer become someone else's problem. With a sullen nod, he waved the column through. The prisoners had been perfect, their eyes fixed on the mud, the very picture of broken hopelessness. Not one glance of hope or recognition betrayed the miracle. Once past, the leader marched on, his spine rigid, while inside he trembled with the aftershock of adrenaline. For miles, he had to maintain the charade until a secluded wood allowed a moment of covert collapse. This was the turning point. Surviving the scrutiny of a dogged NCO meant that lesser obstacles, demoralized regular troops, confused Volkssturm, would pose no real threat. The bluff had been stress-tested and had held. After the checkpoint, the march became a surreal procession through a dying empire. And as the sounds of American artillery grew from a rumble to a thunder, German rear-echelon units began to notice something odd about this particular officer and his silent charges. The final days were a nerve-wracking dance through the edge of the storm. The column now moved through landscapes of abandonment, discarded equipment, burning vehicles. German rearguards, too, focused on their own flight to challenge a lone officer with his sorry work detail. The leader's task shifted from assertion to avoidance. Steering clear of any remaining pockets of actual German command that could issue countermanding orders. Once, a staff car with a major inside slowed. The leader snapped a salute and bellowed a lie about direct orders from corps to secure labor. The major, his face drawn with defeat, merely waved and sped on. In the total collapse, survival trumped duty. The moment of liberation was abrupt and surreal. Rounding a bend, they saw it. A U.S. Army Jeep with a mounted .50 cal, part of a forward reconnaissance screen. The leader ripped off his German cap, grabbed a white cloth, and ran forward, shouting in English, "Don't shoot! We're allies! Prisoners of war!" The GIs, seeing a man in a German officer's tunic yelling at them, initially leveled their weapons in confusion. Then, as the truth dawned, and 150 emaciated men in the remnants of Allied uniforms began cheering and surging forward. The scene dissolved into one of chaotic, tearful joy. The German guards, their purpose evaporated, simply dropped their rifles and sat in the road. The statistic said it all. 150 men who weeks before had been starving on a death march were now free. Not one had been lost in the audacious gambit. The immediate victory was 150 lives saved. But when intelligence officers debriefed the leader, they weren't just hearing a great story. They were studying a masterclass in applied psychology performed on the battlefield of a collapsing state. The immediate impact was multifaceted. The leader's thorough debriefing provided Allied intelligence with a granular, ground-level view of the German military's final implosion. Details on disintegrating unit cohesion, panic-stricken retreats, and the utter vacancy of command authority in the rear areas. This was real-time tactical gold for armies advancing against a ghost of an opponent. The story itself, as it spread through POW camps and later in regimental histories and newspapers, became a potent antidote to the trauma of captivity. It was a legendary tale that proved cunning and courage could overturn even the most hopeless situation. A massive boost to the morale of thousands still in captivity. For his actions, the leader was almost certainly put forward for a high military decoration. His conduct embodied the criteria for awards like the U.S. Distinguished Service Cross, or the British Military Cross. Extraordinary leadership, valor, and resourcefulness under extreme duress, directly responsible for the preservation of 150 lives. The event was meticulously recorded in repatriation reports, yet its almost cinematic nature, a single man bluffing an entire army, has paradoxically kept it as a somewhat hidden gem in the vast archive of the war, overshadowed by larger set-piece battles, but no less significant as a human triumph. It stands as a definitive example of individual agency altering the fate of many at a pivotal historical moment. Historians analyzing the collapse of the Third Reich now see this event not just as an escape, but as a perfect metaphor for the entire endgame, authority evaporating, leaving only performance and will to determine reality. This escape holds enduring significance as a profound case study in several fields. In leadership studies, it is a masterpiece of transformational leadership under duress. The leader possessed no formal rank or authority over his fellow prisoners. He created it through sheer force of character, meticulous preparation, and the articulation of a shared, audacious goal, turning their captivity into a weapon. It is a textbook example of leading from within when all external structures have failed. Within the annals of escape and evasion, it stands alone. Unlike the tunnel breaks or solo journeys, this was a mass escape forward, a deliberate hijacking of the enemy's own logistics to march not into neutral secrecy, but directly toward the Allied advance. It redefined the very concept of a breakout. Sociologically, the event offers a stunning illustration of the fragility of systems built on blind obedience. It lays bare the banality of evil in its final act. The guards were not fanatical ideologues in that moment, but confused, frightened men who deferred to the last uniform that projected certainty. The episode demonstrates how quickly oppressive structures can invert when the performance of power is convincingly co-opted by those it was meant to subjugate. As historian Max Hastings notes, the final collapse created a vacuum where bold individuals could, temporarily, become the authors of reality. This escape thus transcends a mere war story. It is a timeless lesson about the nature of authority, the power of narrative, and the human capacity for audacious ingenuity in the face of absolute despair. It proves that in the right moment, with the right performance, the jailer's costume can become the key to the prison. So what is the ultimate timeless lesson from this story of a stolen uniform and a march to freedom? The ultimate lesson is that freedom is not always seized by force. Sometimes it is claimed by narrative. True liberation wasn't achieved by breaking the locks, but by picking up the warden's keys and performing the role of ownership with such conviction that reality bent to the performance. In the vacuum of a collapsing order, the person who seizes the narrative and projects unwavering purpose becomes the de facto authority. The Germans lost 150 prisoners not to a tunnel or a riot, but to a superior performance of their own command structure, a defeat authored from within their own ranks by a captive. This story is a testament to the human refusal to accept the role of victim. It is about staring at a system designed to dehumanize and break you, and deciding instead to don its skin and walk out the front door, leading others to safety behind you. As his medal citation would later honor, by his magnificent bluff consummate courage and outstanding leadership, he not only secured his own liberty, but was directly responsible for the deliverance of 150 Allied soldiers from captivity in the face of the enemy. This story is documented in liberation reports and medal citations. If you want to discover more incredible true stories of courage and cunning from behind the wire, subscribe. We follow the march to freedom. Next time, we'll uncover an escape of pure endurance. The Wooden Horse of Stalag, Luft 3. How Allied officers built a gymnastics vault to hide a tunnel for a year is a story of patience and genius that stunned the Germans. History marches to a simple beat when the gates are locked. Sometimes the greatest escape is to calmly take the guard's post and order them opened for yourself.